So the 5 red lights illuminate, they go out, and we'll go.
Oh man, it's been so many years since I heard that, and frankly, it's a dream come true for me. Folks, in case you didn't recognize that voice, that is Steve Slater, the voice of F1 personally for me, because by the time I started watching Formula One, he was the voice of Formula One in Asia for the Fox Sports and the Star Sports F1 coverage. And there's just so much history involved in that. It's a whole decade full of listening to him, enjoying to the commentary, and being associated, having him associated to Formula One in the first place. It's a special episode for me. And wow, I am losing my words right now. So I'll actually hand over to Kunal, who can introduce Steve a little bit better. It's the most unconventional introduction we've had to any episode on the podcast. And you can tell why. There's a special connection here.
Oh, yeah. Most unconventional, but most special, I must say. So Steve, of course, is now the CEO of the Light Aircraft Association. So anybody who loves flying and aviation can get in touch with him, because I promise you there's nothing about aviation that we'll probably speak about this episode. But yes, Steve's been the voice of Formula One in Asia for a long, long time. Steve, we've really missed you. It's, when I put out a tweet saying, hey, we're going to have Steve Slater, the legendary Steve Slater, as a guest on our show, and I said, anybody wanting to join in the audience, just, reach out to me. And we had just so many people turn in, send in questions and saying, we'll be there. We'll see the recorded one. We're going to tune into the podcast as well. So thank you very much for joining us, Steve. And like Somil, yours was most certainly the voice that I grew up listening to in Formula One. And I still remember that my mom's dream was always that I end up working with you on the Formula One broadcast. So, she's really chuffed that you're going to be, that we're already talking to you and you're going to be on this episode. So it's fantastic to have you. This is the Voices of F1 series. We've had some of the most legendary names, in terms of people who have broadcast Formula One over the years, over various markets. And it gives me so much joy to welcome you, Steve, to the Inside Line F1 podcast and the Pits to Podium.
Well, thank you. And I've got to say, it's I think something like, 8 years since I last did that, or 7 years. So it's great still to do it. And thank you for the introduction. I mean, it is a privilege for me to be here as well. And, in a way, I've stepped back from Formula One as an active race commentator, and certainly with the demise of Star Sports and ESPN Star Sports. That gave me an opportunity to move on into another career. And it's great, though, to see, dare I say, younger people still there, still doing it and still doing what I did, just as I took over from people like Andrew Marriott, Barry Gill, and the late, great Murray Walker. Formula One goes around and comes around, and it's great to see it.
Absolutely. And the fun fact is, because, of course, Formula One was in that growing phase when you were commentating, there's so many memories associated to you. In fact, my father and my mother both are so excited that we're getting to do this with you. And that's because they were listening to the Star Sports coverage back in the day. But the first things first, sir, as you mentioned, it's been a while since we saw you on air. That's the one big thing that I had in mind when we, of course, thought that we should bring you on. How are you doing and where have you been lately?
Well, I'm sitting on an airfield in Northamptonshire, about 10 kilometres from Silverstone, where we have the headquarters of the Light Aircraft Association. And you can see from the picture behind me, we support people who wish to build their own aircraft, either from kits or even sometimes from their own design, or restore vintage aircraft. And we have about 7,500 members, 7,800 in fact. And we look after the airworthiness of about 2,600 aircraft around the UK. With the Civil Aviation Authority delegate that airworthiness authority to us, and we have a team of over 300 inspectors going around the UK checking that the aircraft are safe. So that's the main part of the job. It's a big business. I'm very lucky and very privileged to have been able to take this role on. For the first couple of years after I stopped commentating for Star Sports, I actually spent in a very cold workshop helping rebuild a 1914 biplane. Which we flew until about a year ago. It's actually under some further rebuild at the moment. And I've just finished 4 years of rebuilding a 1946 Piper Cub. So there's plenty of things. I've still got very dirty fingernails.
Well, there's certainly quite a big love for aviation, but how did the whole Formula One thing come about then? Because, of course, there's the common thread of high speed and performance, but otherwise, these two are completely different worlds. So how did it come about for you?
Well, you'd be surprised actually how many parallels there are between the aerospace industry and Formula One. Both learn from each other. And somebody who worked for British Aerospace Systems developing the Hawk aircraft was detached to work at McLaren for a short period of time. And he said, because it's the fastest production process this side of a war. And they are very similar. They're very connected. And in fact, actually, two of the aerospace engineers senior aerospace engineers I have working for me, also have had motor racing backgrounds. So it really is parallel. How did I segue from Formula One to aviation? Well, we'll cover that story a bit later, I'm sure. But how did I start in Formula One? I started as an amateur motor racer, racing MG midgets and Mini Coopers and various other things badly. My lack of money and my lack of talent were a perfect match. And having had a good accident one year while the car was still on hire purchase, so I couldn't afford to fix it, I was asked by a circuit commentator to commentate on some events at his racetrack. And even I discovered that when I picked up the microphone, the bank balance went up. When I picked up the steering wheel, the bank balance went down. So I stuck with the microphone. And that coincided with the start of satellite television, 1984, 85. And the first satellite sport outside broadcasts, they chose motor racing as a relatively cheap way to cover it, to create it. And I got the job of doing the race commentaries for a channel called Screen Sport, which then evolved into actually Sky and Star Sports in Asia. And in 1999, I was asked I'd already worked in Formula One as a journalist. I'd written for the Times newspaper and various other things, worked for a PR agency in London. But in 1999, I got asked to do my first Formula One race with actually your guest last week, Matthew Marsh, was involved. And we did myself and my co-commentator at that time was a gentleman called Neil Mallard, or I think I was his co-commentator really. And we did the 99 Monza Grand Prix when Heinz-Harald Frentzen won it. That was the one where Mika Häkkinen burst into tears after crashing out at the chicane. So a memorable race. That was a good start.
My word. I was just about to ask you the same thing before we got on, because at least I've heard you for as long as I can remember, but when did it all begin was the question I had in mind. And 99, Mika Häkkinen. And actually, you mentioned Matthew Marsh. Funnily enough, he had something really special to say. He said that he loved the gravitas of your voice whenever you came on air, and especially the intensity you added to the situation. And that's something really special. But for me, it's always been wondering where that catchphrase came from, because the modern generation might of course remember, well, it's lights out, away we go. But for us, it's mainly 5 red lights illuminate, especially back here in Asia. How did that catchphrase come about initially? Because I have open-handedly copied it many, many times, just as a sincere imitation in a way.
Well, I've got to say it was accidental. It was never preordained. And also you have to remember, I think for the first 4 years to about 2002, we didn't have that. We had a red light and it went to a green light. I'm not quite old enough to remember guys standing in the middle of the track with a flag. But although I have seen flag starts at historic motor races, but it used to go red light, green light, and then since everybody was disappearing before the lights had changed anyway, they changed it to the countdown. And I just remember watching it thinking, well, got to say something here, otherwise there's going to be 5 seconds of silence. And that way it went. And it did become a catchphrase, and I'm really glad it did. And and anyone else is free to use it. I don't have a copyright.
Well, I think you should. It's one that's so memorable. But it's a shame that there's not many clips of it on YouTube available. Only one of them. Because I was just wondering that maybe we could just sit back and listen to more of it. But yeah, I think we've got to ask staff for more of that stuff, haven't we?
Well, we came from an era at that time, everything was on videotape, not on digital. And I've still got a box full of VHS tapes stuck in the loft somewhere at home, with some of those race commentaries on. I mean, they're probably actually going to go to the tip, I fear, or recycling. But I mean, what would you do with a bunch of old magnetic tapes? But it was that era, and actually very little of that was digitized. And of course, with the demise and the breakup of ESPN Star Sports, I don't even know where any of that archive would have gone anyway. It was the big studios at Long Chuan in Singapore were closed 6 years ago now, I guess 5 years ago. And I don't know what happened to any of their archive material, if indeed it was preserved. TV is very much a medium that works for today and tomorrow, not for yesterday.
We've got to ask, though. It definitely will be worth it, because I remember the commentary between you and Chris Goodwin, you and Gary Anderson as well, quite distinctively. But in terms of that time, you mentioned something that I wanted to discuss. Why did it all end all of a sudden? Because it was so much fun while it lasted, but Matthew said it switched over to Fox, but why were you not on air, sir, after that point?
Quite simply cost. There's two things. First of all, I always figured from 1999 to, what was it, 2013. I'd always figured, shit, they haven't found me yet. You know, they haven't found me out. And in fact, it's, you know, the last time I did a paddock checkout, the feeling was, you know, I've got away with this for about 10 or 12 years or something, 13, I think it was. You know, how did I get away with this? But I'm very lucky that I was around a golden era of Formula One. Some people say, okay, the Schumacher era was boring. For me, no, it wasn't. It was awesome watching his domination and the creation of a team around him. But coming back to to answer your question, the simple fact, it was finance. The Murdoch organization bought Star Sports, and they were already investing very heavily in Martin Brundle and David Croft, and a very large production team. I think they've got something like 5 ex-Formula One race winners at the moment on their roving pit lane team. And frankly, they didn't need little old me on the end of it. And they could knock out £100,000 or so out of the budget by removing our studio operation. Not that I ever earned £100,000, I hasten, but myself, Gary, or whoever. And they elected to just simply segue across into using the David Croft and Martin Brundle and the existing pit lane structure they already had. Just like you do when you buy a business and cut cost out of it. That's how you make a profit.
But in terms of that whole crew, it was so awesome. And Matthew mentioned something interesting. He said that you used to visit the races, but not very often were you all the time at the circuits. There used to be some element of you commentating away from the track. Was that the case as well? And
oh, crikey, yes. I mean, I'd be commentating off a screen smaller than the one I'm talking to you on now. Quite often. Because
my goodness.
Typically, it would be anything up to £100,000 for the broadcast rights to do live tracks on. So what I would quite often do is I'd be there on the Thursday or even the Friday, then jump on a plane and fly back to London. And particularly for the European races.
Okay.
And then we'd do the actual qualifying and the race. Because actually, once you're into the commentary booth, you're commentating on the picture you're sharing with the viewers. You're not saying, oh, well, I'm looking out the window and I can see something far more interesting than you're watching on the screen. It isn't great television. And I'm interpreting what goes on the screen in front of me. Well, I'm doing my best to. I think it was Murray Walker once said, you just make predictions that are instantly proved wrong. But you're trying to interpret. And one of the things that I hoped I brought to Formula One over the years, with my background around the paddocks and things like that, is I wouldn't just say, oh, look at that. I would actually say the reason why that's happened, or what the thinking might be that's going on in that driver's head. And that's always a bit of a challenge in itself. But that was for me the challenge and the pleasure of doing it. And I know a lot of viewers sort of felt that was what interpreted Formula One. And at the end of the day, I was just merely an interpreter of the action that was happening in front of me. And doing that in a studio is very little different to doing it while I'm in a commentary booth. And sometimes it's better because you're not actually distracted by other things going on outside the window.
I'm actually going to jump in here to, put some more perspective to what Steve said. So, when I was on the other side of the broadcasting studio, as a viewer, I was like, yeah, how much does it cost to just send 5 people to a Grand Prix and, just give them a commentary booth? The truth is it costs a lot of money. And I believe, yeah, exactly. And, it's not just, the best seat in the house, but all the technology that comes in, all the satellite and the broadband connections and the likes. And I believe it was a little more expensive, relatively during the Bernie Ecclestone era. So the Liberty Media has streamlined things and made it more affordable. But, off-tube commentary is literally the way that most channels have built their broadcasts on. And I must say Formula One offers fantastic archival, a bank of archival content that broadcasters use time and again to showcase more of these stories as well. So I totally understand why cost can be a reason for such decisions.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, Bernie Ecclestone and FOM at the time, they were totally profit-driven, rightly so. That's what we were here to do. Liberty have brought in an entertainment-led view of it, and something I 100% support because I think they're brilliant. And I'm really pleased that the way that Liberty have developed things and things like Drive to Survive and various other things. So it is making F1 much more relevant in the current media environment. And I wouldn't say we were behind the times on that. We weren't. But as I say, we originally came from certainly a videotape era. And people a generation before me were still shooting on film. So, you have to remember that when we used to use a pit lane camera in those days or do an interview in the pit lane, we had something the size of a machine gun attached to the cameraman's shoulder and had to keep stopping regularly to change batteries and tapes. With modern digital, you don't need all of that.
No, seriously. But it amazes me how costly it actually was. And to hear it right now from this perspective, it's actually interesting to see how things play out on the backside of it. But commentating from a screen smaller than the one you've got right now, in that time when there was no social media, this is something that Matthew mentioned, that you guys would be scrambling for information. Just what was that experience like when you've got barely any contact with what's happening on the track? You're just forced to interpret the images that the viewers see. So what differentiates you from the viewer in that case? How tricky was that challenge?
Preparation is what it came down to. I would typically go into a Grand Prix, and actually I know David Croft and Martin Brundle still do it. I'd typically go into a Grand Prix with 24 pages minimum of notes. I would have at least 2 pages on every team. So if a camera shot picked, and I did spend a lot of time going around teams, as Kunal will remember, just meeting people, chatting with people, recognizing faces, and I would put names to faces in the pit lane. I would have a list of those names on for each team, the key people. So I could sort of say if they appeared on the screen, oh, that's so-and-so, that's what he does, or X is what he does. But also, actually, once the race is in action, you're interpreting what happens on the screen, actually all the preparation, and even some of the data that comes up now on the modern F1 coverage only reproduces what I'd actually already got by monitoring timekeeping or whatever. I mean, at the very start of my time around motor racing, and I was very lucky, I got to work for an agency which worked with Williams in Formula One from 91. And I also worked with Jackie Stewart's Formula 3000 team, which then became Stewart and then Jaguar F1. And I mean, in those days, in the early days of the Formula 3000 team, Jackie, myself, and a couple of other guys would be on the pit wall keeping lap charts, actually writing down the numbers of the cars as they went past and then keeping a chart of them each lap, which was something a bit different. And keeping good old-fashioned steam lap charts used to be something I used to even keep doing in the commentary booth in case, or in the earliest days when we didn't really have very sophisticated graphics.
That sounds pretty crazy. I mean, just noting it down and everything, analyzing it. Would you do it on the go, though? That's the interesting part. Wow. Yeah. Well, commentating on the race.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact,
wow.
Yeah. And dare I say it, if you were on the pit lane in a Formula 3 team in Britain in the, say, 89, 90, 91, you'd be you'd be doing that mechanically, literally on a grid, set of grids on a piece of paper. And Formula 3 was a lot more difficult because there were an awful lot more cars packed together going past you, sometimes 3 at a time. So, a grid of 24 Formula 3 cars would probably go past you in 4 seconds. To write all those down in order was a real challenge.
My goodness. But what was Jackie Stewart like? I've just got an impromptu question in my head because you mentioned working with him. I suppose you did some work in PR before you got into Formula 1 as well. Was that something along the same lines there?
Yes, absolutely. And I worked with Jackie in the PR role, doing some PR for Stewart Racing team, and also for some of the drivers who came through, because one of my roles was working with General Motors and Vauxhall at Opel. And we had a young driver program, a staircase of talent, as Jackie called it. And some of the drivers that came through that staircase of talent came through Stewart Racing, and most notably David Coulthard. But I also was lucky enough to work with Damon Hill. I worked with Mika Hakkinen, well, both the Mikas, Hakkinen and Salo, and a lot of the other names who then came through into Formula One. Juan Pablo Montoya was another of my Opel Lotus drivers. And we had a great group. And actually, a lot of drivers who didn't necessarily get into Formula One, people like David Sonnenschein, who's been very, very pivotal for single-seater and Porsche racing and various other things in Asia. I was very lucky in that there was a huge bunch of those people, the Wians, as one of my PR colleagues used to call them, people who became people like Dario Franchitti. It's a huge spread of motor racing. It was pretty cool thing to do.
And that atmosphere, just being around, and that club racing atmosphere is just something quite special, right? Especially when you know that there might be young gems later on that might become big names later on. What is that whole experience like?
Well, it was great. You never thought about it in the historical sense at that point, obviously. But what I would say is that I'm seeing Formula E producing some of that now, and including some Asian drivers. And I think that is going to be very much a proving ground. We've had the transition now from, dare I say, superannuated Formula One drivers to new talent moving through Formula E, and it is now a career path. And that's really important.
I'm actually intrigued that you follow Formula E. It's very interesting. That can add up to a really good conversation towards the end of the episode, because there's a lot of stuff that I'd love to know your take on. But firstly, I have to ask you about that whole golden period that you mentioned after you transitioned up from Stewart into commentating into the early 2000s. And one might call that the most colorful phase of Formula One, if I may, with the characters. You mentioned the likes of Bernie, you mentioned the likes of Michael. Just that period, seriously. Do you think Formula One has lost color since that time? And being over there, was it the circus that we all read about it like? I mean, in all the books that have been written about that period.
I've never really thought about it. We got on with it. I think the cars were visually and orally more exciting. They sounded awesome. I remember the first year of the turbo hybrid era, I was in the paddock behind the pits, and I didn't even hear the cars go out at the start of the free practice session. And that was a shock, given the fact we'd just the previous year gone from the 2.4 litre Formula One V8 Formula One engines, revving to, was it 13,000 RPM or something? The cars these days are not the oral feast that the V8s and V10s and V12s were. And I think that's a great pity. They've done a good job of trying to improve the sound quality of the cars. The cars themselves, I think, have become, because they're just built around the energy recovery systems and things, they've inevitably become bigger and fatter and perhaps a little bit more numb. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the 2022 cars, because we're starting to migrate back to proper racing cars again. The simple fact is that a 2020 or 2021 Formula One car was nearly as big as a Le Mans 24-hour racing car. That's like, we're getting into truck racing here. But I think we're going to see. But the great thing was we got some brilliant racing out of those.
We did, yeah.
Particularly as we lost the total, as we're moving away from a total dependence on aerodynamics and downforce, and that's a hard thing when you've got a team that's probably paying 400 aerodynamicists to tell them they can't use aerodynamics is just giving them a challenge to try and find yet more holes in it. But we'll see, I think, quite a few surprises in 2022, because I think some of the established teams will get it wrong, just as we had Ferrari got it wrong with their engines, and Renault before them. I think we'll see an awful lot. We might well see a team like Renault or McLaren or Aston Martin, whoever, may well suddenly, all of a sudden, become much more competitive, and one of the big names might stumble. So, well, we can only wait and see when the testing kicks in.
Well, there's a good chance that might be Ferrari, no? Historically, they've not quite been the best at adapting to the new regulations. What do you reckon about that?
Yes, I mean, well, they were able. Contrary to popular belief, Ferrari does not have a massive resource behind it. It has money behind it, yes. It doesn't have huge rows of engine test beds or anything like that. It's probably got less engine resource than Mercedes. Okay. Because Mercedes have their own specific factory, whereas Ferrari's engines are developed within the complex. I don't, it's always been a surprise to me that Renault have been patchy since the beginning of the 2000s, really. We haven't had the commitment from there. Be interested to see how Red Bull, with a redefined Honda engine, are going to work, and how they're going to work in terms of resource as well. But the simple fact is that Ferrari aren't as massive as people think they are. The team is quite intimate. They have had a challenge, and I've got to say that the period when Ross Brawn, Jean Todt, Michael Schumacher, and various others, they really integrated that team and made it work. You could be cynical and say that when that group all split up, Ferrari said they were going back to traditional Italian values. I remember the press conference, and we all sniggered at the time. Traditional Italian values means 6 guys trying to change the same wheel.
and doing it in 45 seconds instead of 2.
Well, yes, but as long as they remember that the big ones go on the back.
Well, don't you give them a challenge? They might end up doing better than we thought they did, than we think they can do, rather.
I'd like to see it. I think Formula One needs Ferrari to be successful. And there's nothing to beat the passion of the Italian public for their home team. Alfa Romeo don't quite score.
Yeah.
Haas, although they're Ferrari powered, don't have that identity. What I would say is one of the things I will be watching Haas very closely with this year will be to see how Mick Schumacher develops, because I could easily see there will be a decision to be made at the end of 2022 as to which Ferrari driver he replaces.
Well, exactly. And actually, I want to dwell on that a little bit more, because Mithila, Kunal's wife, who's also a big Ferrari fan and a big Kimi Räikkönen fan, had a question to ask you. There's not me here. I'm just reading out exactly what he said. She said, rather, I'm sorry. I always thought that he was pro-Ferrari and Michael Schumacher. Was that really the case? Is that really the case, though? I mean, it's totally justified if that's the case. Because if you see someone develop from that level, must be.
Pro-Ferrari means being anti-anybody else, and that isn't the case. But what I would say is, at that time, in that period of Michael Schumacher's time at Ferrari up to 2006, they were by far the best team. And you've got to compliment them for that efficiency. And they didn't do it on as much of a bigger budget than some people think. They certainly were probably on a par with McLaren's budget, probably a little bit ahead, but not a huge amount. Not the domination of spending power that we've seen by some teams in Formula One since. And in that particular period, what was it, 240-something races between Michael doing Benetton and then Ferrari, and he won 91 of them. And he started with a team that was a shambles. It took him, 3 years before he won a race. So, that winning percentage is still as good as anybody in modern Formula One. Michael Schumacher, 36% of the races he started, he won. Lewis Hamilton's 35% of the races he started, he won. So, I think actually, it's a real sign, not just of Michael Schumacher's domination and ruthless domination sometimes, but actually just the sheer the sheer performance of the whole team. And I've got to say, no, I'm not entirely pro Ferrari, because I was with a whole load of other people in Williams spitting nails when he took Damon Hill out on a couple of occasions.
No, that was such a controversial incident. But it's so amazing that.
Which one?
94, there was Australia, there was 96 with Villeneuve, there was, Schumacher and Williams had a tough time with each other, no?
Yeah. Well, Williams were the winning team, and Ferrari had to find a way of beating them.
Well,
and we look at Williams clunking around at the back at the moment. It's very sad to see that. That's a sign of some strategic decisions that went really badly wrong in the mid 2000s. And even as late as the Montoya era, you still had a Williams that was a race-winning car. Yeah. And these days, I really think that I'd love to see Williams come back. I really would. They'll be a midfield team, I'm sure, if they can get their act together. They deserve to be.
But I can imagine, right, at Williams, the day when they signed a Schumacher, not Michael, Ralph. I can imagine what the atmosphere must have been like. Oh, come on, not this surname again. But it's crazy, though, how Schumacher's dominance spurred on so many great characters in the sport, right? I mean, we all know about Flavio, about how flustered he might get at times. And then Renault, of course, had their golden years. We all know about Bernie, of course, how he was so colorful in his own way. But in terms of that as well, Ron Dennis, too. Have you got any fond memories of those guys who would quite definitely be on the chasing side once Michael was just always on a flow?
I think if you ever said you had fond memories of Ron Dennis, he'd sue. Ron was a hard taskmaster for everybody. He was utterly focused. He actually came from a very humble background. This is one thing people forget with Ron Dennis. He didn't arrive with a couple, 10 or 20 million in Formula One to try and make it into 100 million. He arrived as a race mechanic. And he worked for McLaren in the old days. He started
Project 4?
Project 4 Racing. And in fact, his PA at Project 4 Racing became an office PA for me when I worked in a PR agency. But Project 4 was forever having to fend off the people wanting the electricity bill paid and things like that. And they were hand to mouth for a number of years. But Ron turned it around. He hired some fantastic people. And that's one of the great things with Ron, was that he was able to do that and motivate them. And of course, Chris Goodwin was a key part of that, because Chris was involved with both as a test driver and as a chassis designer and design driver on the road car projects, and also did some of the testing with the F1 cars in the West era. So that was a really interesting time to be involved in that as well. So I've got to say, there were some great things to look at, and being on the outside now, I keep saying I'm still watching Grand Prix and commentating on. The only difference is I do it sitting on the sofa with a beer in my hand.
Oh, come on. We've got to listen, though. Just place us on a call at the same time, and that'll be fun. That's all we ever need. We'll put our coverage on you. Don't worry. That'll be so awesome to hear that. But McLaren, I actually want to dwell on McLaren and Ferrari for a second, because it's such an amazing Pandora's box you opened up a second ago when you said Ferrari aren't as big as we think they are. And when you said that the engine resources aren't the biggest, Enzo Ferrari must be angry in his grave, if he could be, after hearing something like that. But why did McLaren not win in that case if Ferrari weren't as big as we always thought they were in terms of resources?
That's a very good question. I think that there were lots of other teams around. If you really wanted the powerhouse of that era, you were probably looking at Williams Renault. Technically, they were fantastic. Their aerodynamics were way ahead. One of the challenges is that Williams, at the end of the 90s, moved into so they basically were the first people to pioneer a full-size wind tunnel. You could, instead of making an aerodynamic model, you built a full-size car. And of course, they got that full-size wind tunnel program got outlawed. And suddenly Williams had this massive asset on their hands they couldn't use for Formula One anymore. And they spent a lot of money on it. And that was one of the challenges for Williams. But the Williams-Renault, in that sort of Damon Hill, I mean, you think about it, they had Jacques Villeneuve, Damon Hill, all went on for world championships. And, the tragedy, of course, was also the hiring of Ayrton Senna and Ayrton Senna's death. But I think even at that time, they were a team that was matching Michael Schumacher and Benetton. They were the team that was winning races. McLaren was still the upcoming team, probably the third best team on the grid at that time. And they turned that around into being multiple world champions. So that has to be a sign. Any one of the teams probably now in the top 5 in Formula One could potentially be the world championship winning team this year if they get a lucky break. Remember the old BAR Hondas, which became Braun, and they inherited Super Aguri's idea of a double diffuser.
Yep.
And in actual fact, it was Super Aguri who were running at the back who came up with the aerodynamic tweak that was adopted by Ross Brawn.
What could have been?
And won Jenson Button the world championship.
What could have been? Takuma Sato, 2009 world champion, imagine. Oh, my goodness. According to a plan, we were supposed to go for something else. But no, I want to stick to this one because I want to ask you about that whole project. Honda, Super Aguri, those 2 years, 7 and 8. When I started watching, was a big fan of Honda because of the livery. And there was so much fun stuff going on because they had that livery in the Formula One game, a pirated one, of course. And it was interesting because they had someone that sounded similar to you, calling out the grid names, and I used to copy that as well. So that's another personal memory attached to it. But why did that never work out with Honda? And how does it take just one Ross Brawn to change things so much? Can that be the influence of an orchestrator? Can the influence of an orchestrator be so much in the world of Formula One?
I think Honda, there's was a technical reason in that era. And from when I remember when Jordan had been running the Honda engine and they moved, I'm trying to think, what did they move to? Was it a Mercedes? I can't remember that. But I always remember they unpacked the new engine and thought, is this it? Because the Honda engine was totally focused on its power output and its torque. Yet it was thermally very inefficient. Yeah. It required very big radiators, very big oil coolers, gave the aerodynamicists a nightmare. And I'm trying to remember what the engine was that Jordan then went to. It might have been the Persian. But either way, they unpacked the engine out of the box and they went, it's so much more compact. The aerodynamics can be completely altered on the car because the engine's more compact, the radiators are more compact. And Honda had they had a very clear design philosophy. But it was a nightmare to package in that era. I think the other thing is Honda very much was managed from it wasn't just a Honda racing separate operation. Yeah. It still had a huge amount of input from the automaker itself. And you had an awful lot of management by committee, by consensus, which is the Japanese way of doing things, which actually doesn't mean you can move as quickly sometimes. To make a decision over the 2023 engine or something like that would have required them starting about 2018, I think that is another major part of why they struggle. They seem to have gained the reputation of almost nearly winning the world championship and then selling their assets or pulling out just in time for someone to take on those assets and win the world championship with. It's in terms of PR own goal, it's a pretty good one.
And with Honda, there was the opposite side of Toyota who always had the resources for it, but never even got close. Now, and while we're at it, I want to know your take on that because what is it? Toyota had a state-of-the-art facility. They always had decent drivers helping them out. Always one young one paired by an experienced one. Just what happened there?
Well, I really honestly couldn't tell you because you have to remember when Toyota applied their corporate mind to World Championship rallying, they dominated.
Yeah, exactly.
They were the Ferrari or the McLaren of rallying. And I really don't think that, I went to the facility in Cologne. It was a superb facility. One of the challenges might be that they actually elected basically to grow the facility out of their rallying programs, which were dominated by Cologne. And when you put your factory in Cologne, you can't tap into the workforce of people that are in the motorsport valley in the UK. Where I'm sitting now, I can literally almost look at the crowd of my window at the roof of the Mercedes F1 facility. 5 kilometres over my other side is the what was the Force India and Jordan factory, is now Aston Martin Racing. Another 10 kilometres beyond that is Red Bull Racing. Just up the road at Banbury, we have a whole load of operations feeding into operations like Haas and other people. So we've got this motorsport infrastructure here in the UK, and just down the road a bit further is Grove, where Williams are based. So we've got a great motorsport infrastructure. And a lot of people, tens of thousands of people who work in that. So when you need to hire a new designer or something, you can put an advert out. The guy doesn't have to move house or move country to go to work. And Kunal, you'll know the challenges that it took for you to move to Silverstone. And I think that that was probably one of the challenges. They couldn't necessarily tap into the best of the talent pool. And dare I say, that could be one of the reasons why Ferrari struggled a little bit. They're sat down, and also you've got Alfa Romeo as well.
Interesting.
There is a cluster in Italy and in northern Italy, and that does feed into Hinwil in Switzerland as well. But you do have that little bit of a cluster. And wherever you've got people ever tried to run an F1 team in isolation, it's been a bigger step for them to take up.
Yeah. In fact, Ferrari did have a design office in the UK, but shame it was only one person. Had it been more, who knows what could have happened?
Well, yeah, but that one person was Mike Barnard, so it was a very talented one person. And in actual fact, there's a lot of specialist moulding done for Ferrari in the UK by specialist subcontractors and things like that. There are people out there who will provide, but will not ever specify who's on their client list. I remember seeing some Ferrari tubs being prepared for shipment to Maranello. They were experimental ones probably, but either way, that sort of thing happens all the time in motorsport. You go to the best supplier. Containing it all in your own workshop sometimes isn't the most efficient way of doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, well. Actually, we've got a few fun questions from the audience, and thank you so much, folks, for joining in. And these are the questions I'd like to bring in. Firstly, let's actually go in chronological order in terms of the time frame. So we'll go with Santosh first, who's got a question. He says, "Hello, Steve. Santosh here. Big fan, and you have been the voice of my F1 journey back in the 2000s. My question, I remember the entire Star Sports team, including Karun, being extremely flabbergasted by the end of the 2012 Brazilian GP. Please share a few throwback moments and thoughts with respect to that given race." I remember the reaction to the Hulkenberg crash. That is something that sticks with me for a long time.
I've got to say, without going to notes and things like that, it's one I would struggle to really remember. The one I do remember in Brazil, of course, was the 2008 race, when Lewis Hamilton won by a single point, won the championship. I really, honestly can't share with you the 2012 Brazilian Grand Prix because it hasn't stuck in my memory. But what I would say, that 2008 one was probably one of the greats for me, when Lewis passed Timo Glock for fifth on the last lap in the wet. Glock was driving on completely worn out tyres. 2008 for me is one of my favourite seasons ever. If you ever get to see or hear the final laps of that 2008 race, you'll hear Karun interrupt me going, "No, he's not world champion. It's Lewis. Lewis is going to have him." And then you'll hear us, as the car crosses the line, roar with laughter.
What?
And the reason for that was we were watching it on probably something like a 14-inch or 15-inch monitor screen. And Karun and I got closer and closer to the screen. We realised at the end of the race we were both on our hands and knees on the desk in front of the screen, holding our microphones. Literally on our hands and knees with our noses pressed against the screen. And we then just both burst out laughing. And for me, that was one of the absolute greats of Formula One and of that 2008 season. Mm-hmm. And we had the opposite, of course, because we had the first ever night race in Singapore, 2008. And, which then went into infamy, of course, with the infamous PK inverted commas spin. And Alonso winning the race. But also, I mean, the drama's in the pit lane that day. That was the day that Felipe Massa got to the end of the pit lane still carrying the refueling hose. So that for me sticks as something which I can, that season sticks in my memory a great deal. So I'm so sorry, Santosh, but I would have to go back to my notes to remember what had happened in 2012.
But actually, I will get back on Vettel and the whole Massa incident, because there's another story that I want to discuss with you, sir, on that. But first, a question from Nimish. With all your experience and knowledge, what's your take on 2021, the entire season and that infamous last race? Man, I would have loved to hear your take on it live as it happened. What would it take to get you back in the broadcast booth?
I'd probably got myself sacked, because I know what I was saying while I was watching it, just sitting on the sofa. I've got to say, I don't think that Michael Massey, it was his finest hour. I saw that in your last podcast, Matthew was very defensive of Michael. And I think Michael was working under a huge amount of pressure. However, some of that, the structure of what he was working in, had put him under that amount of pressure. And some of his comments back to Jonathan Wheatley on the Red Bull pit wall, and to Toto Wolff, were verging on the unprofessional. And not only unprofessional for what is this multi-million-dollar sport. And he should have been more measured in what he'd done. He should have, from actually the previous 3 or 4 races, he should have been more authoritative. And he wasn't. Whether that's something that Michael can fix himself, I hope he can, because I think he's actually a very good and very worthy guy. Whether they need to put a better structure in around him so he's more protected and can make his decisions in better isolation, that would be good. But actually, forgetting all of that, probably Verstappen deserved to be the world champion. He had been the fighting force. Lewis was on the defensive and Mercedes were on the defensive, certainly for the last 5 or 6 races. And Verstappen went out, and even when there were times where he could have backed off a little bit maybe, and with the hindsight he should have done, but he was actually able to attack all the time, and he is an attacking driver. He's an exciting driver, and there are certain drivers over the history of Formula One, go back to Nigel Mansell, go back to Ayrton Senna, go back to Michael Schumacher, and I would say Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen are 2 of the others. That the moment the camera goes on them in the car, something interesting can happen.
Exactly.
And that is so important. There have been very worthy world champions who haven't been spectacular. With those guys, you always knew you were going to get some bit of drama somewhere.
Yeah.
And Max Verstappen is very much in that category.
Exactly. He's added a lot of colour into the world of Formula One. For better or for worse, that depends on who's watching, definitely. But it's amazing to have these characters on. And before we end this episode, sir, I have to ask you about the one character that characterized essentially your time of commentating with Star and my time of listening. So that's basically early 2010s, late 2000s, essentially. Sebastian Vettel. Isn't it funny that the year you left Star was the year Sebastian Vettel won his last World Championship? He hasn't done well since you haven't been in the commentary booth. What's going on there?
No, that's right. Bear in mind, Michael Schumacher and I retired at the same time, so it was a good year to go. No, but quite seriously, Sebastian, has the fire gone out?
Yeah.
I suspect it has a little bit. But there's a saying, and now having spent the last few years working in aviation, you may well be losing your God-given talents, but your experience ensures you don't have to use them anymore. Now, Sebastian is still a quick racer. I don't think he's had a race car that suited him in the last season at Aston Martin. He inherited a car that was designed around other people. I think Sebastian still has a great deal to give, and he will, both in PR terms for the team, but also as a driver, I think be in a really good position to do well in 2022. Will 2022 be his last season? I wouldn't be surprised. I think that he is now reaching the end of that career. I'll tell you what, he'd make the most awesome TV content. The guy has a brilliant sense of humour. He's fantastic in all the different languages he speaks. And he's a quick driver. There's no two ways about it. He would, if you put him into Hamilton's Mercedes, he wouldn't be that far away from Hamilton, I'm sure, and probably could be quicker in some situations. He's not as impetuous. But you have to remember that when he first started, he was like Max Verstappen. He was the youngest driver ever to win races in Formula One. And before that, it was Fernando Alonso, who was another one of that breed where if you see Alonso in a car, something good's going to happen. And Kimi Raikkonen was the same.
Exactly. No, I wish we had the chance to ask more about them, about drivers and whether styles matter so much when you're someone competing at the top level. But we will get to that maybe in another episode. But one last question has just popped up and we've got to take it in from Devik. It's an amazing one. Hello, sir. Just curious, which driver has brought you the most emotions on and off the track? Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one.
I think Karen Chandler, because off the track, particularly in the commentary booth, I used to be the recipient of his elbow in the ribs when A, he wanted the microphone off me, or B, he was wishing to, shall we just say, discount some of the spurious knowledge I was just about to impart. But no, quite seriously, of all the drivers, to see Damon Hill become world champion was a very special moment because I know what Damon had gone through, from being a motorcycle dispatch rider to pay his monies to becoming a world champion and his and supporting his family as well. And Damon's high up on my list of the good guys. And as I say, I think my best season ever was 2008, and that championship finale. I felt so bad for Felipe Massa because, again, the Massa family are the high up on my list of the good people, and very unaffected. And yes, he's got a posh executive jet. Yes, he's got a villa in Sao Paulo and all the rest of it. But actually, Felipe Massa is a very ordinary guy, and the family are. The family will all go and eat at a restaurant the restaurant's in Monte Carlo, but they'll all go and eat at a fairly normal restaurant by one of the main bus stops if you want to take the bus to Nice. So that's the sort of family that the Massas were, and I would have loved to have seen Felipe Massa crowned a world champion.
Would have been so much fun, though. Alternate reality. But sir, final question for today. Just what will it take to get you back in the commentary box? We so want it badly.
Don't applaud, just throw money. No, quite seriously, it's never been about money for me. It's about a passion. If an opportunity came to be in the commentary box and do a meaningful job in the commentary box, I would be there. I still do some commentary. I actually commentate on air shows in the UK with a historic aircraft. There's a wonderful collection in Bedfordshire called the Shuttleworth Collection. I do a number of airshow commentaries there each year. Done some commentary for the Air Race 1 series, including in Thailand and in China. But this way, if I could do it and I could fit it in and I was making a difference and was doing a good job, I'd be proud to come back. But I also have a very full-on job here as Chief Executive of the Light Aircraft Association. And actually today it's a perfect flying day with me sat behind my office desk for the rest of the day and my aeroplane sitting down the road waiting for me to fly it, but I won't get to. So, flying vintage aeroplanes has always been a very big passion for me as well. So I've been very lucky to combine them both. I've got to play with all the toys in the toy box. How good is that?
Exactly. But oh man, so it's been so great to have you on this episode. Thank you so much for joining in, and thank you for all the members of the audience who stuck around to listen.
Yes,
thank you, folks. And thank you for sending in your questions too. In case you liked this episode, which I'm sure you did if you've listened to this point, don't forget to leave a good rating for the podcast, to subscribe, to leave a like, all that good stuff. But thank you so much once again, folks. Thank you for being a part of this episode, and we shall see you rather soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.